Some promises we make as children stay with us forever, even when we never expect them to come true. There's something powerful about the innocence of a child's heart that can touch even the hardest soul. Jonas Shepherd was once known as the mountain man, living alone in the Colorado wilderness after a violent past. 16 years ago, a traveling preacher came through with his 7-year-old daughter, Patience. The little girl looked up at the grizzled man and said, "I'll marry you one day, Mr. Jonas." He laughed it off as childhood talk, but her words became the one gentle memory in his rough life. Now Patience has returned as a grown woman with secrets of her own. Will she remember the promise she made to a lonely mountain man? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Jonas Shepherd's modest ranch as he stepped onto the weathered porch, coffee mug in hand. At 56, his hair had gone silver at the temples, and lines mapped the years around his grey eyes. But his frame remained solid from decades of hard work. The mountains rose behind him like ancient guardians, their peaks touched with snow even in early September. He surveyed his land with quiet satisfaction. 20 head of cattle grazed in the near pasture, and his small cabin sat sturdy against the hillside. It wasn't much by some standards, but it was honest work, clean work, the kind of life he'd never imagined possible in his younger, bloodier days. Jonas carved a small wooden cross from his pocket, running his thumb over the smooth surface. He'd whittled it during his darkest period, when guilt and whiskey had been his only companions. Now it served as a reminder of how far he'd traveled from the man who'd once been feared from Denver to Santa Fe. The sound of hoofbeats on the dirt road pulled him from his thoughts. Sheriff Morton approached on his bay gelding, his weathered, a face grim beneath his hat brim. "Morning, Jonas," Morton called out, dismounting near the porch. "Mind if I water my horse?" "Course not. Coffee's fresh if you want some." Morton nodded gratefully, leading his horse to the trough. "Heard some talk in town yesterday. Thought you should know." Jonas's jaw tightened slightly. Even after 16 years of peaceful living, his past had a way of surfacing like a bad penny. "What kind of talk?" "Wade Garrison's been asking questions about you, about your land." Wade Garrison owned the largest spread in 3 counties, a man who collected property, the way some men collected bottle caps. Jonas had refused his previous offers to buy the ranch, but Garrison wasn't known for accepting no as a final answer. "Let him ask," Jonas said quietly. "This land isn't for sale." Morton accepted the coffee cup with calloused hands. "Be careful, Jonas. Garrison's got influence, and some folks in town still remember the old stories about you." The old stories. Jonas could recite them himself. How he'd ridden with the Dalton gang for 2 years, how his gun had sent 7 men to early graves, how he'd earned the name Mountain Man after disappearing into the wilderness like a ghost. All true and all part of a life he'd left behind. That was a long time ago, Sheriff. I know it was. And I know the man you are now. But some people have long memories and short patience. After Morton left, Jonas returned to his morning routine. He fed the cattle, mended a section of fence damaged by the previous night's wind, and checked the small vegetable garden behind the cabin. Simple tasks that brought him peace. But as he worked, his mind wandered to that day 16 years ago, when everything had begun to change. Preacher Samuel had appeared on the mountain trail like a vision, his covered wagon creaking under the weight of traveling supplies and religious materials. Most folks avoided the high country where Jonas lived then, but the preacher had been different. He'd shown no fear, only curiosity about the hermit who'd made his home among the peaks. Named Samuel, the preacher had said, his daughter peering shyly from behind his legs. "This here's my Patience. We're heading to California, but I was hoping we might share your fire tonight. Been traveling 3 days without seeing another soul." Jonas had intended to send them away. Visitors meant complications, and complications meant trouble. But something about the little girl had stopped him. She couldn't have been more than 7, with auburn hair that caught the firelight and eyes bright with innocent wonder. "You're very tall," she'd observed, studying him with the frank curiosity of childhood. "Are you a giant?" Her father had apologized, but Jonas found himself smiling for the first time in months. "No, little miss, just a man who lives in the mountains." "A mountain man," she'd said, delighted with her own cleverness. They'd shared his simple meal, beans and hardtack, while Preacher Samuel spoke of his mission to establish churches in the frontier settlements. Jonas had listened, surprised by how much he enjoyed the conversation after so many months of solitude. When bedtime came, little Patience had approached him with serious eyes. "Mr. Jonas, are you lonely up here all by yourself?" The question had caught him off guard. "Sometimes, I suppose." She'd nodded solemnly. "Papa says God has a plan for everyone. Maybe your plan includes not being lonely forever." Then she'd smiled, that bright, innocent smile of childhood, and spoken the words that would echo in his heart for 16 years. "I'll marry you one day, Mr. Jonas, when I'm all grown up." Her father had laughed, gently chiding her for such forward talk, but Jonas had been struck silent, not by the words themselves. Children said all manner of things, but by the absolute certainty in her voice, as if she'd glimpsed some future. He couldn't see. The next morning they'd continued their journey west, and Jonas had watched their wagon disappear down the mountain trail. He'd expected to forget them within a week, but the memory had lingered, especially during the long winter nights when the wind howled through the peaks. 6 months later, he'd made his first trip to Pine Ridge in 2 years, then another. Gradually, he'd begun the slow process of rejoining the human race. Now, 16 years later, Jonas lived quietly on his ranch 5 miles outside town. The people of Pine Ridge had grown accustomed to him over the years, though some still watched him with wary eyes. He bought supplies at Miller's General Store, attended church on Sundays, and helped his neighbors when they needed an extra hand. He'd built a reputation for fairness and reliability, though few people would call him friend. Dr. Bailey was one exception. The town physician had seen past Jonas's reputation to the man beneath, especially after Jonas had helped deliver Mrs. Patterson's baby during a difficult birth 3 winters back. "You've got gentle hands for a man with your history," Doc had observed afterward. "A man can change," Jonas had replied, "if he wants to badly enough." Mrs. Fletcher, who ran the boarding house, had also warmed to him over the years. She'd lost her husband to consumption and understood something about starting over. Sometimes she'd save him a piece of pie or ask his opinion on repairs to her property. But for all his integration into town life, Jonas remained fundamentally alone. He ate his meals in solitude, spent his evenings reading by lamplight, and slept in a bed meant for one person. He'd had opportunities for companionship. Widow Thompson had made her interest clear on several occasions, but nothing had stirred his heart. The truth was, he'd been shaped by a 7-year-old girl's innocent declaration. Not that he believed she'd actually return to marry him. That was childhood fancy, nothing more. But her words had shown him a different version of himself, a man worthy of love and gentleness. He'd spent 16 years trying to become that man, even if he'd never have the chance to show her. As afternoon shadows lengthened across his property, Jonas unsaddled his horse and began the evening chores. Tomorrow would bring another quiet day, much like today and the day before. It was a good life, a peaceful life, even if it was sometimes lonely. He had no way of knowing that tomorrow would change everything, that the stagecoach arriving in Pine Ridge would carry a passenger who would turn his orderly world upside down. He couldn't foresee that the little girl who'd made him a promise would return as a woman who'd keep it, or that his carefully constructed peaceful existence was about to be tested by forces beyond his imagination. For now, he simply tended his cattle, repaired his fences, and carved another small cross from a piece of pine wood, adding it to the collection he kept in his cabin. Each one represented a day of redemption, a step away from the man he'd been toward the man he hoped to become. The gay mountains stood silent around him, keeping their secrets and his, as they had for 16 years. The afternoon stagecoach wheezed to a stop outside Miller's General Store in a cloud of dust and creaking leather. Jonas happened to be loading supplies into his wagon when the door opened and a young woman stepped down onto the wooden sidewalk. She moved with quiet grace, her traveling dress modest but well-made, her auburn hair pinned neatly beneath a simple hat. She carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to making her own way in the world, but there was something in her posture that spoke of weariness, not physical exhaustion, but the bone-deep tiredness that came from carrying burdens. Alone, Jonas found himself staring, though he couldn't say why. Something about her seemed familiar, like a half-remembered song or a dream upon waking. She was perhaps 23 or 24, with the kind of natural beauty that needed no enhancement, though there was a guardedness in her eyes that suggested life hadn't always been kind. The stagecoach driver handed down a worn leather traveling bag and a smaller case. "This is Pine Ridge, miss. You sure this is where you wanted?" "Yes, thank you." Her voice carried a slight accent, educated, refined, but with hints of frontier practicality. She pressed a coin into his palm. "I appreciate your kindness during the journey." As the stage pulled away, she stood alone on the sidewalk, looking around the small town with careful assessment. Her gaze swept over the church, the saloon, the sheriff's office, and finally settled on Jonas himself. Their eyes met across the dusty street, and something passed between them. A flicker of recognition that neither could quite place. She tilted, her head slightly, studying his face with the same intensity he was studying hers. Jonas felt his heart begin to pound in a way it hadn't for 16 years. There was something about her eyes, about the way she held herself, that stirred memories he'd thought safely buried, but it couldn't be. It was impossible. She approached slowly, her travel-worn Bible clutched in one hand, her bag in the other. As she drew closer, Jonas could see the pressed flowers between the pages of the good book, and handwritten notes in margins worn soft by handling. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I'm looking for Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house. Could you direct me?" Jonas found his voice with effort. 2 blocks north, the White House with green shutters. Mrs. Fletcher runs a clean, respectable place. Thank you." She paused, still studying his face. "You seem familiar somehow. Have we met?" The question hit him like a physical blow. Could it be? After all these years, was it possible? "I don't believe we've been properly introduced," he said carefully. "Jonas Shepherd." Her eyes widened slightly, and he saw her grip tighten on her Bible. "Shepherd," she repeated slowly. "The mountain man?" The old nickname on her lips confirmed what his heart had been trying to tell him. This was Patience, little Patience, who'd made him a promise with such sweet certainty. But she was no longer a child, no longer the innocent girl who'd seen possibilities he couldn't imagine. "You remember me," she said. And it wasn't a question. Patience. Her name felt strange on his tongue, weighted with years of wondering. "My lord, you've grown up." A smile flickered across her features, sad and knowing. "That's what 16 years will do to a person." She set down her bag and extended her hand with adult formality. "Patience Morrison. I was Patience Samuel when you knew me before." Morrison. She'd married. Of course she had. A woman like her wouldn't have remained single long. The realization cut deeper than he'd expected, even though he'd never allowed himself to seriously believe she'd return for him. "Congratulations on your marriage," he managed. Her expression grew somber. "I'm a widow, Mr. Shepherd. My husband passed 2 years ago. My father died 3 years past. I'm sorry for your losses." He meant it. Preacher Samuel had been a good man, and she was clearly still grieving both men. "Thank you. Papa spoke of you often over the years. He said you were a man capable of great change." An uncomfortable silence stretched between them as townsfolk began to take notice of their conversation. Jonas was aware of curious stares, whispered conversations. The return of the mountain man's mysterious visitor would be the subject of supper conversations throughout Pine Ridge tonight. "What brings you back to this part of the country?" he asked. "Papa had a friend here, Reverend Matthews. I was hoping to find him, but I'm told he moved on 2 years ago." "He did, good man. The circuit preacher comes through monthly now." She nodded, looking suddenly lost. "I see. Well, I suppose I'll need to make other arrangements. If you don't mind me asking, what sort of arrangements?" Patience looked down at her Bible, her fingers tracing the worn leather cover. "I'm a school teacher. Mr. Shepherd, I was hoping Reverend Matthews might help me find a position, but..." She trailed off, clearly uncertain about her next step. "The town's been needing a proper teacher," Jonas found himself saying. "Mrs. Patterson's been doing her best with the children, but she's got her hands full with 5 of her own. The town council's been talking about hiring someone qualified." Hope flickered in her eyes. "Do you think they might consider me?" "I'd be surprised if they didn't. Education's a valuable thing out here." Another silence fell between them, this one less. Uncomfortable but heavy with unspoken history. Jonas was acutely aware of how she'd changed. The girl had become a woman of substance and character, but he could still see traces of the child who'd looked up at him with such trusting eyes. "I should let you get to Mrs. Fletcher's before dark," he said finally. "She'll take good care of you." "Yes, of course." Patience picked up her bag, then hesitated. "Mr. Shepherd, Jonas, I want you to know that I do remember our meeting. Not all of it, but some. Papa used to tell me stories about the mountain man who showed us kindness when we needed it most." She didn't mention the promise. He found himself both relieved and disappointed. "Your father was a remarkable man. He saw good in people when they couldn't see it in themselves." "He did indeed," she smiled, and for a moment he glimpsed the bright-eyed child she'd been. "I hope we'll have occasion to speak again while I'm in town." "I'm sure we will. Pine Ridge is a small place." He watched her walk away, her spine straight and her step determined despite the uncertain circumstances that had brought her here. Several times she paused to look back, as if checking to see if he was still watching. He was. That evening, Jonas sat on his porch long after the sun had set, turning the carved wooden cross over and over in his hands. Patience's return changed. Everything and nothing. She was here, but not for him. She was free, but carrying grief. She was the woman the little girl had promised to become, but she was also a stranger. The smart thing would be to keep his distance, to let her settle into town life without complications from his past. She deserved better than a former gunfighter, with blood on his hands and a reputation that would follow him to his grave. But as he sat there in the darkness, listening to the night sounds of the mountains, Jonas found himself remembering her smile and the way she'd said his name. For the first time in 16 years, the loneliness that had been his constant companion began to feel like something that might, possibly, be healed. He had no idea that Patience was sitting at her window in Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house, looking out toward the mountains and thinking of him. He couldn't know that she was holding a faded drawing, a child's sketch of a mountain and a stick-figure man, and wondering if fate had brought her home to keep a promise she'd made with the innocent certainty of childhood. The wooden cross grew warm in his palms as he held it, a talisman against the hope that was beginning to bloom in his chest like wildflowers after rain. Patience had been in Pine Ridge for 3 days when she found her father's journal. She'd been unpacking her few belongings in the small but comfortable room Mrs. Fletcher had provided when she discovered the leather-bound book wrapped carefully in her father's old shirt. Her hands trembled as she opened it, recognizing his familiar handwriting on pages yellowed with age. The entries were sporadic, covering their travels across the frontier in the years after they'd left Colorado. But one section, dated just 6 months after their encounter with Jonas, made her breath catch. "I find myself thinking often of the mountain man we met in the high country. Patience asks about him frequently, though I suspect she remembers more than she admits. There was something in that man's eyes, a hunger for redemption that I recognize because I've felt it myself. I pray that God will show him the path too. Peace, for I believe he has the capacity for great good if he can forgive himself for the evil he's done. Should the Lord's plan bring us together again, I would be honored to call him friend. Further down the page, in her father's careful script, Patience drew another picture of her mountain man today. I asked her why she's so certain she'll marry him someday, and she looked at me with those serious eyes and said, "Because, Papa, God told me in a dream. He's going to need someone to love him back to being good." The faith of children humbles me. Patience closed the journal with shaking hands. She remembered the dreams now, vivid, recurring dreams of a tall man with gentle hands and sad eyes. In the dreams, she was grown up and he was waiting for her in a place where mountains touched the sky. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Fletcher's voice came through the door. "Miss Morrison, there's someone here to see you." Patience composed herself quickly and went downstairs to find Mayor Henderson waiting in the parlor, his wife beside him. Both looked nervous but determined. "Miss Morrison," the mayor began, "we understand you're a qualified schoolteacher." "I am. I taught for 4 years in Kansas before my husband's death." Mrs. Henderson leaned forward eagerly. "We desperately need someone to teach our children proper. Mrs. Patterson's been doing her best, but she's got her own little ones to mind, and frankly, she never got much schooling herself." "The town council met last night," Mayor Henderson continued. "If you're interested, we'd like to offer you the position. The salary isn't much, $30 a month plus room and board, but it's honest work." Patience felt a surge of relief. "I would be very grateful for the opportunity." "Wonderful!" Mrs. Henderson clapped her hands together. "We can have the schoolhouse ready by Monday. It's been sitting empty for 2 years. After they left, Mrs. Fletcher brought tea and settled into her favorite chair with a knowing smile. "You seem pleased with this development." "Very much so. I was beginning to worry about my prospects." "Might I ask what brought you to Pine Ridge specifically? It's not exactly on the main routes to anywhere." Patience hesitated, then decided honesty was the best policy. "My father spoke often of this area. He had friends here. Anyone in particular?" "Jonas Shepherd." Mrs. Fletcher's eyebrows rose. "The mountain man? Well, that's interesting. You know him?" "I should say so. He's helped me with repairs around this place more times than I can count. Never takes payment, just tips his hat and goes on his way. He's a good man, despite what some folks whisper about his past." "What do they whisper?" Mrs. Fletcher sat down, her teacup with a decisive click. "Foolishness, mostly. Stories about his wild days, which were long before he came to Pine Ridge. All I know is the man who's lived here for 16 years wouldn't hurt a fly unless it was threatening something he cared about." That afternoon, Patience walked through town to examine the schoolhouse. It was a simple building, but solidly constructed, with large windows that would provide good light for reading. As she stood in the empty room, imagining it filled with children's voices, she became aware that someone was watching her. Jonas Shepherd stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands. "Mrs. Fletcher told me you'd gotten the teaching position," he said. "Congratulations." "Thank you. I'm quite excited about it." He stepped into the room, looking around with a practical eye. "Building's sound, but it'll need some work before Monday. Floors need sweeping, windows cleaning. I could help if you'd like." The offer surprised her. "That's very kind, but I wouldn't want to impose." "No imposition. Town needs a proper school." They worked together for the next 2 hours, their conversation gradually becoming more comfortable. Jonas proved to have practical skills and gentle hands. He repaired a broken desk with the patience of a craftsman and cleaned the windows with meticulous care. "You're very handy," Patience observed, watching him secure a loose floorboard. Man learns to do for himself, living alone." "Have you always lived alone?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "Most of my adult life, yes. That must be lonely sometimes." He paused in his work, his hands stilling on the hammer. "Sometimes. But there are worse things than loneliness, such as hurting people you care about because you don't know how to be better than you are." The admission was quiet, almost whispered, but it revealed more about Jonas Shepherd than all the town gossip combined. Patience felt her heart clench with sympathy. "Monsieur, father believed people could change," she said softly. "He said redemption was always possible for those who truly sought it." Jonas looked up at her then, and she saw something vulnerable in his grey eyes. "Your father was a wise man." He was. He also said that sometimes God puts people in our lives to help us become who we're meant to be. And what did you think about that? Patience felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I thought he was usually right about such things." Their eyes met and held, and for a moment the years seemed to fall away. She could almost see the man her father had glimpsed beneath the mountain. Man's rough exterior, someone worthy of love, someone capable of tenderness. The moment was broken by voices outside. Through the window, they could see several townspeople approaching, including Wade Garrison, the wealthy rancher Mrs. Fletcher had warned her about. Jonas's entire demeanor changed, his shoulders tensing as he recognized Garrison among the group. "I should go," he said, gathering his tools quickly. "Jonas, wait!" But he was already moving toward the back door, clearly wanting to avoid whatever confrontation Garrison's presence might bring. He paused at the threshold, looking back at her with something that might have been regret. "Welcome to Pine Ridge, Miss Morrison. I hope you'll be happy here." Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving her alone to greet the approaching townspeople and wonder why a simple conversation about redemption had felt like the most important words she'd spoken in years. The pressed wildflower fell from between the pages of her father's Bible as Patience prepared for her first day of teaching. She caught it carefully, a delicate mountain bloom, purple and white, that had somehow retained its color despite being pressed for so many years. Memory came flooding back with sudden clarity. She had picked flowers like this during their journey through the mountains, gathering them for the kind mountain man who had shared his fire and his simple meal. Her father had helped her press them in his Bible, and she'd given Jonas one before. They'd left, a small token of gratitude from a child's generous heart. Now, 16 years later, she held another flower of the same variety and wondered if it was coincidence or providence that had brought her back to this place. Her first week of teaching went better than she dared hope. The children of Pine Ridge were eager to learn, starved for the kind of structured education she could provide. She had 12 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, including the Patterson children, the banker's twin daughters, and several others whose parents had scraped together the modest fees. But it was during her second week that Jonas appeared at the schoolhouse again. She was sweeping the front steps when she looked up to find him approaching with something in his hands, a wooden slate and chalk, carefully crafted and perfectly sized for small fingers. "Made this for young Timothy Patterson," he said, offering it to her. "His family can't afford to buy one, but every child deserves the tools to learn." Patience accepted the slate, running her fingers over the smooth wood. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each edge perfectly sanded, the frame joined with the precision of someone who took pride in his work. "This is beautiful. You made it yourself?" "Work with my hands helps me think." "What do you think about?" The question seemed to surprise him. "Lots of things. How different my life might have been if I'd learned to read and write properly as a boy. How much I admire what you're doing here." "You admire teaching? I admire you." The simple statement hung between them, honest and unadorned. Patience felt her pulse quicken, but before she could respond, Jonas stepped back as if he'd revealed too much. "I should go. Don't want to keep you from your work." "Jonas, wait." She moved closer. Close, enough to see the flecks of blue in his grey eyes. "Would you like to see what we're learning? The children have made remarkable progress." He hesitated, clearly torn between desire and uncertainty. "I wouldn't want to intrude." "You wouldn't be. In fact, would you consider visiting regularly? Some of the older boys, especially, could benefit from hearing about practical skills, about how education applies to real life." "You want me to talk to your students?" I want you to share your knowledge. You know more about surviving in this country, about working with your hands, than anyone else in town. That's valuable learning too." The idea clearly appealed to him, though he tried to hide it. What would the parents think about having someone like me around their children? They'd think their children were lucky to learn from someone who's lived enough life to have wisdom worth sharing. That afternoon, Jonas returned with his horse and wagon. Several of the older students gathered around as he explained how to properly care for livestock, how to read weather signs, how to repair harnesses and tools. His natural teaching ability surprised Patience. He was patient with their questions, clear in his explanations, and gentle with their mistakes. After the children had gone home, Jonas lingered to help her tidy the schoolroom. "Thank you for today," Patience said. "You were wonderful with them. They're good children. Reminded me why education matters. You're more educated than you give yourself credit for. Life has taught you things no book could." Jonas was quiet for a moment, stacking primers with careful precision. "Sometimes I wonder what might have happened if I'd met your father when I was younger, before I made all those mistakes. Papa always said it's never too late to choose a different path. Even for someone like me?" Patience turned to face him fully, noting the uncertainty in his voice. "Especially for someone like you. You've already chosen a different path, Jonas. Look at this ranch, this community work, the way you helped me today. That's not the mountain man everyone whispers about. That's the man you've become." They walked outside together as the sun began to set behind the mountains. The evening air was cool and sweet, carrying the scent of pine and the distant promise of autumn. "Patience," Jonas said suddenly. "There's something I need to tell you." But before he could continue, the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted them. Wade Garrison rode up with two of his men, his expression dark with barely controlled anger. "Miss Morrison," Garrison said, touching his hat brim with mocking courtesy. "I hope you're settling in well to our little town." "Very well, thank you." Garrison's gaze shifted to Jonas and his voice hardened. "Shepherd, I thought I made my position clear about you hanging around respectable folks." Jonas's posture changed subtly, his body settling into the relaxed alertness of someone prepared for trouble. "I don't recall asking for your opinion, Garrison. Maybe you should start caring about it. This is a decent town with decent people. We don't need reminders of the bad old days." Patience felt anger flare in her chest. "Mr. Garrison, I don't know what you're implying, but Mr. Shepherd has been nothing but helpful and respectful." Garrison's smile was cold. "Has he told you about his past, Miss Morrison? About the men he's killed? About why they called him the Mountain Man?" "That's enough," Jonas said quietly, but there was steel beneath the soft words. "Is it? Maybe the school teacher should know what kind of man she's keeping company with. Maybe she should know that decent women don't associate with killers." The insult hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Patience saw Jonas's hands clench at his sides, saw the way his jaw tightened with control that was costing him considerable effort. "Mr. Garrison," Patience said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "I am perfectly capable of choosing my own associations, and I choose to associate with people who judge others by their present actions, not their past mistakes." She stepped closer to Jonas, a gesture of support that didn't go unnoticed by anyone present. Garrison's expression darkened further. "You're making a mistake, schoolteacher. This town has a long memory, and some debts never get paid in full." With that cryptic threat, he wheeled his horse around and rode away, his men following. Jonas stood silent for a long moment, staring after them. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with regret. "I'm sorry you had to see that. Maybe it would be better if I—" "Don't you dare," Patience interrupted. "Don't you dare let that man drive you away from doing good work. He's not wrong about my past. He's wrong about who you are now, and that's what matters to me." Jonas looked at her then with something like wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. "Why?" he asked simply. Patience felt her heart hammering as she prepared to take a leap of faith, Because 16 years ago, a little girl made you a promise, and now that she's grown up, she's beginning to remember why. Jonas kept his old Colt 45 wrapped in oiled cloth at the bottom of his trunk, beneath winter blankets and memories he rarely disturbed. He hadn't touched it in 3 years, but Garrison's threat had stirred something uneasy in his gut, an old instinct that whispered of coming trouble. The gun was clean and well-maintained, despite its long storage. Some habits died hard, and a man who'd lived by his weapon knew better than to let it deteriorate. As he rewrapped it carefully, Jonas hoped he'd never have cause to wear it again. But Wade Garrison wasn't the kind of man who made idle threats. A knock at his door interrupted his dark thoughts. Through the window, he could see Patience approaching. With a covered basket, her step light despite the evening shadows. "I brought supper," she said when he opened the door. "Mrs. Fletcher made extra stew, and I thought you might be tired of your own cooking." The domestic gesture touched him more than he cared to admit. It had been years since anyone had thought to bring him a meal. Years since his cabin had welcomed a woman's presence. "That's kind of you. Come in." Patience stepped inside, looking around his simple home with obvious interest. The cabin was spartanly furnished but scrupulously clean. A table and 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, shelves lined with the few books he'd managed to acquire over the years. His carved crosses occupied places of honor on the mantelpiece, each one a small testament to his ongoing redemption. "You're a reader," she observed, examining the book spines. "Teaching myself, mostly. Never had much formal schooling." She pulled out a worn copy of the Bible, noting the careful annotations in the margins. "You've been doing a good job of it. Your handwriting is quite fine. Your father gave me this Bible that night we met, said it might help me find my way." Patience traced the cover with gentle fingers. "He gave Bibles to many people, said they were seeds that might grow in the right soil." They shared the stew at his simple table, the conversation flowing more easily than it ever had before. Patience told him about her teaching methods, her plans for expanding the children's education beyond basic reading and arithmetic. Jonas found himself sharing stories of his ranch work, his observations about the changing seasons in the high country. "I've been thinking about what you said," Patience said, as they finished eating, "about the promise I made as a child." Jonas's spoon stilled in his bowl. "You don't need to." "Yes, I do. I need you to understand something." She leaned forward, her eyes earnest in the lamplight. "I didn't come to Pine Ridge because of that promise. I came because I was lost and alone, and this was the only place that felt like it might still hold something good from my past. I understand, but now that I'm here, now that I see the man you've become, Jonas, that little girl may have spoken from innocence, but the woman sitting here with you now speaks from choice." The words hung between them, weighted with possibility and fear. Jonas felt his heart hammering against his ribs, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. "Patience, you don't know everything about my past. The things I've done, I know enough. I know you've spent 16 years trying to make amends. I know you're gentle with children and kind to widows. I know you've carved a dozen crosses and read my father's Bible until the pages are soft with handling." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. Her skin was warm, soft against his work-roughened palm. "I know you're a good man who's been alone too long." Jonas turned his hand palm up, threading their fingers together. It was such a simple gesture, but it felt like a miracle. This woman, choosing to touch him, to offer him the grace of human connection. "I've thought about you every day for 16 years, he admitted quietly, "not because of any promise, but because you showed me there might be something in me worth redeeming. And have you found it? That something worth redeeming? I don't know. But I'd like to try if you'll help me look." The kiss happened as naturally as breathing. Jonas cupped her face in his hands, marveling at the trust in her eyes as she leaned into him. Her lips were soft and sweet, and when she sighed against his mouth, he felt 16 years of loneliness begin to crack open like winter ice, yielding to spring. When they broke apart, Patience rested her forehead against his, her breath warm against his cheek. "I've been dreaming about you," she whispered. "Ever since I was a little girl, I've had dreams about a man with gentle hands and sad eyes who was waiting for me in the mountains." "I've been waiting," Jonas said simply. "I didn't know what I was waiting for, but I've been waiting." They sat together in comfortable silence as the fire crackled in the hearth. Jonas had never imagined such contentment was possible. This sense of rightness, of pieces falling into place after years of displacement. But their peace was shattered by the sound of gunshots in the distance, followed by the frantic ringing of the town bell. Jonas was on his feet instantly, his body responding to the call of danger with the reflexes of his former life. Through the window, he could see an orange glow against the night sky. "Something's burning," Patience said, moving to stand beside him. Jonas's jaw tightened as he recognized the direction of the flames. The schoolhouse. They rode into town to find half the population forming a bucket brigade, trying to save what they could of the burning building. The fire had taken hold quickly, consuming the dry wood with hungry efficiency. Sheriff Morton approached them, his face grim with soot and suspicion. "Started about an hour ago. Funny thing is, someone saw riders heading away from town right around that time, riders that looked a lot like Garrison's men." Jonas felt the familiar cold rage building in his chest, the same fury that had once made him feared across 3 territories. But this time it was different. This time he had something worth protecting, something worth fighting for. Patience stood beside him, watching her carefully prepared classroom turn to ash and ember. Her face was pale but determined, her hands clenched at her sides. "They're trying to drive me away," she said quietly. "They're trying to drive us both away," Jonas corrected. "Garrison knows that hurting what you care about is the surest way to hurt you." "What do we do?" Jonas was quiet for a long moment, watching the flames consume the little school where Patience had been so happy, where she'd been building something good and worthwhile. "We rebuild," he said finally, "and we make sure it doesn't happen again." But even as he spoke the words, Jonas knew that rebuilding wouldn't be enough. Garrison had escalated beyond mere intimidation into open warfare. And when a man like Wade, Garrison decided to destroy something, he didn't stop until he'd succeeded or been stopped himself. The old instincts were stirring again, the survival skills that had kept him alive through years of violence and danger. Jonas had spent 16 years trying to bury the mountain man, but as he watched Patience's dreams literally go up in smoke, he began to wonder if some battles could only be won by embracing the darkness he'd worked so hard to overcome. The gun in his trunk suddenly felt heavier, more present, as if it knew its time of resting was coming to an end. The faded photograph had been hidden in Jonas's Bible for 16 years, tucked between the pages of Psalms where he'd read about forgiveness and redemption. It was a simple thing, a traveling photographer's work taken during one of his rare trips to town in the early days, but it showed Patience as she'd been that long-ago evening, her small hand clasped in her father's, her eyes bright with the fearless confidence of childhood. He'd never meant to keep it. The photographer had been selling copies to anyone who'd pay, and Jonas had bought it on impulse, telling himself it was just a memento of the night his life had begun to change. But as the years passed, it had become something more, a talisman, a reminder of possibility, a promise he'd made to himself to become worthy of the faith that little girl had shown him. Now, as he sat across from Patience in Mrs. Fletcher's parlor 3 days after the fire, Jonas found his hand moving unconsciously to his shirt pocket where the photograph rested. "The town council met this morning," Patience was saying, her voice steady despite the exhaustion evident in her posture. "They want to rebuild the school, but it will take time. Months, probably. What will you do in the meantime?" "Mayor Henderson suggested I could hold classes in the church basement. It's not ideal, but the children need their education." Jonas admired her determination, the way she refused to let Garrison's intimidation tactics achieve their goal. But He could see the toll the past few days had taken, the shadows under her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was looking. "Patience," he said softly. "There's something I need to show you." He pulled out the photograph, his fingers reluctant to let it go. When he handed it across to her, he watched her face change from puzzlement to wonder, to something that might have been tears. "You kept this," she whispered, staring at the image of herself at 7 years old. "I told myself it was just a keepsake, but the truth is, it became the most precious thing I owned." She looked up at him, the photograph trembling in her hands. "Jonas, why?" "Because that little girl saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. Every time I was tempted to slide back into my old ways, every time the loneliness got too heavy to bear, I'd look at that picture and remember that someone had believed I could be better. And did you become better?" "I tried. Every day for 16 years, I tried." Patience set the photograph on the table between them and reached for his hands. "You succeeded. The man who kept this picture, who carved all those crosses, who helps children learn and widows with their repairs, that man is everything that little girl saw and more." The admission that had been building in his chest for days finally broke free. "I love you, Patience. I've loved the memory of you for 16 years, and now I love the woman you've become." She was quiet for a long moment, her thumbs tracing circles on the backs of his hands. When she spoke, her voice was soft, but certain. "I love you too. I think I've been loving you my whole life without realizing it." The kiss they shared was different from the first, deeper, more sure, weighted with mutual recognition and promise. Jonas felt something settle in his chest, a peace he'd never experienced even in his quietest moments alone. But their happiness was interrupted by urgent knocking at the front door. Mrs. Fletcher hurried to answer it, returning with Sheriff Morton, whose expression was grave. "Jonas, I need to speak with you, privately." They stepped onto the porch, leaving Patience waiting anxiously inside. Morton removed his hat, running his fingers through his thinning hair. "Garrison came to see me this morning. He's making accusations." Jonas felt the familiar cold settle in his stomach. "What kind of accusations?" "He claims you started that fire, says he has witnesses who saw you near the school that night." "That's a lie, and you know it. I know it. But Garrison's got influence with the territorial authorities. He's talking about bringing in federal marshals, claiming you're a threat to the community." "Let him try. I haven't broken any laws." Morton shifted uncomfortably. "Jonas, there's more. He's been asking questions about your past, digging up old stories. He seems to know things about you that most folks around here have forgotten." The implications hit Jonas like a physical blow. If Garrison had access to his complete history, if he knew about all the warrants and wanted posters from the old days, he could make Jonas's life, and Patience's, a living hell. What does he want? Your land. He's been trying to buy up all. The property between his ranch and the railroad survey line. Yours is the last piece he needs. And if I don't sell, Morton's expression was answer enough. Garrison would destroy him, destroy Patience, destroy anyone who stood in his way. That evening, Jonas sat with Patience on his porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains they both loved. He'd told her about Morton's visit, about Garrison's escalating threats, about the impossible choice they were facing. "We could leave," she said quietly. "Go somewhere he can't find us. Start over. Is that what you want?" "I want to be with you. The place doesn't matter as much as the person." Jonas was touched by her loyalty, but he could hear the sadness in her voice. She'd found a home in Pine Ridge, a purpose in teaching those children. Asking her to abandon it all for his sake felt like another kind of betrayal. "There might be another way," he said slowly. "What do you mean?" Jonas was quiet for a long moment, weighing his words carefully. "Men like Garrison understand only one language. Maybe it's time I reminded him that some conversations are best had in that language." "Jonas, no, you're not that man anymore." "Aren't I?" He turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting the dying light. "What if everything I've built here Everything we've found together was just borrowed time. What if the mountain man was always who I really was, and these 16 years were just me pretending to be someone else? Patience stood abruptly, moving, to face him with fierce determination in her eyes. Don't you dare let that man convince you that goodness is weakness or that redemption is a lie. But what if... No. She gripped his shoulders, forcing him to meet her gaze. You are Jonas Shepherd, not the mountain man. You are the man who carved crosses and kept a child's photograph and learned to read the Bible by firelight. You are the man I'm going to marry, and I won't let anyone, including you, convince me otherwise. Her certainty was like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. Jonas pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest, as if she could anchor him to the better man he'd worked so hard to become. But even as he held her, even as he promised himself he'd find another way, Jonas could feel the old darkness stirring in his blood like a hibernating beast, catching the scent of coming spring. The wanted poster was yellow with age, but still legible, the sketch bearing an unmistakable resemblance to a younger Jonas Shepherd. Wade Garrison spread it across Sheriff Morton's desk with the satisfied air of a man playing a winning hand. "Murder in the first degree," Garrison read aloud. $5,000 reward, dead or alive. Federal warrant issued by the Territorial Court in Denver, 1873. Still active, according to my sources. Morton studied the poster with growing unease. "Where did you get this?" "I have friends in Denver, friends who remember the mountain man and his exploits." Garrison's smile was cold as winterstone. "Seems our reformed neighbor isn't as reformed as he'd like us to believe. This is 23 years old, Wade. Even if it's legitimate, oh, it's legitimate. The murder of Samuel Cross, territorial judge, shot down in broad daylight during a bank robbery in Georgetown. Witnesses put Shepherd at the scene." Morton felt his heart sink. If this was true, if Jonas really was wanted for killing a judge, then all of Garrison's threats suddenly carried the weight of federal law. "What do you want me to do about it?" "Your job, Sheriff. Arrest him. Send word to Denver that you've got their man. Justice will finally be served." But something about Garrison's eagerness troubled Morton. In all his years as sheriff, he'd learned to read men, and Wade Garrison was enjoying this far too much for a man simply interested in upholding the law. "I'll need to verify this through proper channels," Morton said carefully. Garrison's expression hardened. "You do that, Sheriff. But remember, harboring a known fugitive is a federal crime. Wouldn't want your own career to suffer for misplaced loyalty." After Garrison left, Morton sat staring at the wanted poster, wrestling with his conscience. He'd known Jonas for 16 years, had watched him build a reputation for honesty and quiet service to the community. The idea that this gentleman could have murdered a territorial judge seemed impossible. But the sketch was undeniably accurate, and the warrant bore official seals that appeared genuine. If he ignored this information and it came to light later, his own position would be forfeit. That evening, Morton made his way to Jonas's ranch, dreading the conversation ahead. He found Jonas and Patience sitting on the porch, her head resting on his shoulder as they watched the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Evening, folks," Morton said, his voice heavy with reluctance. Jonas immediately sensed trouble. He'd known the sheriff long enough to read the signs, the slumped shoulders, the inability to meet his eyes directly. "What is it, Bill?" Morton handed over the wanted poster without preamble. "Garrison brought me this today. Says it's legitimate, straight from Denver." Jonas took the poster with steady hands, though Patience felt the slight tremor that ran through his body as he read. His face went pale, then flushed with what might have been anger or shame. "Jonas." Patience's voice was small, uncertain. "It's real," he said quietly. "The warrant, the charges, all of it. But you said you'd never killed anyone who didn't deserve it." "A territorial judge." "I didn't kill Judge Cross." Jonas's voice was firm, certain. "I was in Georgetown that day, but I had nothing to do with his murder." Morton leaned forward. "Then who did?" "The man who actually robbed the bank. A man named Buck Garrison. The name hung in the air like a physical presence. Patience felt understanding dawn with sick certainty. Garrison, as in Wade Garrison, his father. Buck was the leader of our gang for about 6 months before I realized what kind of man he really was. He killed that judge for sport, not because he had to. Shot him down while the man was begging for his life. Morton frowned. But the witnesses were bought or threatened. Buck had connections, people who owed him favors or feared him. It was easier to blame the mountain man than to cross Buck Garrison. Why didn't you defend yourself? Fight the charges? Jonas's laugh was bitter. With what? I was a known outlaw with a reputation for violence. Buck was a respected businessman, at least on the surface. Who would have believed me? So you just ran? I disappeared into the mountains. Figured it was better than hanging for a crime I didn't commit. Patience reached for his hand, her mind racing. Jonas, if you're innocent men hang just as easy as guilty ones, especially when powerful people want them dead. Morton cleared his throat uncomfortably. Jonas, I believe you. But belief isn't going to help if federal marshals come calling. Garrison's already talking about sending word to Denver. How long do I have? Maybe a week, maybe less. That night, after Morton had gone and Jonas had retreated, into brooding silence, Patience found herself unable to sleep. She paced her small room at Mrs. Fletcher's, her mind churning with the implications of what they'd learned. Wade Garrison wasn't just a greedy rancher trying to force Jonas off his land. He was the son of the man who'd framed Jonas for murder. And now he was using that same crime to finish what his father had started. But why wait until now? Why not use this information years ago? The answer came to her as she was brushing her hair before the small mirror above her washstand. Garrison had been content to let Jonas live quietly as long as he posed no threat. But Jonas's relationship with her, his integration into the community, his growing happiness, these things made him visible again, made him dangerous to whatever long-term plans Garrison harbored. On impulse, she pulled out her father's Bible and began searching through the pages. Preacher Samuel had been meticulous about recording his travels, his encounters with people along the frontier. If he'd met Buck Garrison, if he'd witnessed something, she found it tucked between the pages of Ecclesiastes, a folded letter in her father's careful handwriting, dated just 2 months after their encounter with Jonas. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. My dearest Patience, the letter began, I'm writing this account in the event that my testimony might someday be needed. Today I witnessed a terrible injustice in the town of Georgetown. A federal judge named Samuel Cross was murdered during a bank robbery, but the man being blamed for the crime is innocent. I saw the real killer, a man named Buck Garrison, shoot the judge in cold blood while another man tried to stop him. That other man was Jonas Shepherd, the mountain man we met in the high country. He was trying to prevent the murder, not commit it. I have tried to convince the authorities of the truth, but Garrison's money speaks louder than a traveling preacher's word. I fear Jonas Shepherd will pay with his life for another man's crime, unless God provides a way to reveal the truth. I pray this testimony may someday serve justice. The letter was signed and dated, witnessed by 2 other travelers who had apparently seen the same events. Patience clutched it to her chest, her heart pounding with excitement and hope. Evidence. Real evidence of Jonas's innocence, written by a man whose word had been respected throughout the frontier. Her father had literally held Jonas's life in his hands and had tried to save him, even when no one would listen. She dressed quickly and ran through the dark streets to Jonas's ranch, clutching the letter like a lifeline. She found him sitting on his porch, his packed belongings beside him. You're leaving, she said, her heart breaking. It's the only way to keep you safe. If I'm gone, Garrison has no reason to hurt you. But what if you don't have to go? What if I told you there was proof of your innocence? Jonas looked up at her with tired eyes. Patience. It's been 23 years. Whatever proof might have existed is long gone. She held out the letter with shaking hands. My father saw it happen. He wrote down everything he witnessed, had it witnessed by others. Jonas, you were trying to stop Buck Garrison, not help him. Jonas took the letter with disbelief, his eyes scanning the careful script by lamplight. As he read, his expression changed from skepticism to wonder, to something that might have been hope. Your father, he whispered, all these years, I thought no one had seen the truth. He tried to help you then. Now his testimony can help you again. Jonas stood slowly, pulling her into his arms. Do you understand what this means? If this letter is accepted as evidence, you're free. We're free. Garrison loses his hold over you. But even as they held each other, both knew the battle was far from over. Buck Garrison might be dead, but his son was very much alive and would not surrender his plans easily. The letter was evidence, but it was also a declaration of war. The sealed letter had been hidden inside Preacher Samuel's Bible for over 20 years, tucked between pages that spoke of justice and divine retribution. Patience discovered it purely by accident while searching for additional evidence to support her father's written testimony. This letter was different, marked, "To be opened only upon my death," in her father's distinctive script. Her hands shook as she broke the wax seal, unfolding pages that felt heavy with secrets and sorrow. My beloved daughter, the letter began, if you are reading this, then God has called me home and left you to carry forward the work I could not complete. The testimony you have already found regarding Jonas Shepherd is true, but it is not the whole truth. What I witnessed in Georgetown was more than a simple murder. It was the beginning of a conspiracy that has haunted me for decades. The letter went on to detail not just Buck Garrison's murder of Judge Cross, but a systematic campaign of intimidation, bribery, and violence that had allowed Garrison to build his empire. Samuel had documented names, dates, and crimes, a meticulous record of corruption that reached far beyond one territorial judge's death. Buck Garrison murdered 3 other men who threatened to expose his activities, Samuel had written. I have evidence of his involvement in claim jumping, railroad fraud, and the disappearance of at least 2 federal investigators. Jonas Shepherd became his scapegoat because the mountain man's reputation made him the perfect villain. No one would question that such a man might kill a judge, but the most damning revelation came in the letter's final paragraphs. Before his death, Buck Garrison confessed these crimes to me, believing he was dying of fever. He recovered, but not before revealing the location of documents that would prove Jonas's innocence and expose the full extent of his own crimes. These documents are hidden in a metal box beneath the floorboards of the old courthouse in Georgetown, 3rd plank from the east wall. I have been too much a coward to retrieve them myself, but perhaps you, my dear daughter, will find the courage I lacked. Patience found Jonas in his barn, methodically checking his weapons with the careful precision of a man preparing for war. The sight sent a chill through her. This was the mountain man she'd heard whispered about, dangerous and alert, every movement economical and purposeful. I found another letter, she said without preamble, handing him the pages. Jonas sat down. The rifle he'd been cleaning and read in the lamplight, his expression growing darker with each revelation. When he finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Georgetown is 3 days' ride, he said finally. We should tell Sheriff Morton this evidence won't mean anything without those documents your father mentioned. And even if we find them, who's to say they haven't been destroyed after all these years? Patience moved closer, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands never strayed far from his weapons. You're planning something. I'm planning to survive. Garrison's not going to wait for us to build a legal case. He knows about your father's testimony now. He has to know, or he wouldn't be moving so aggressively. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching riders echoed across the valley. Jonas immediately moved to the barn's entrance, rifle in hand, while Patience stayed back in the shadows. Sheriff Morton rode up with Doc Bailey and Mayor Henderson, their faces grim in the moonlight. "Jonas!" Morton called out. "We need to talk." "What's happened?" Morton dismounted heavily, Garrison's hired gunmen, at least 6 of them, maybe more. They rode into town this afternoon, asking questions about you and Miss Morrison. Doc Bailey stepped forward. Professional killers, from the look of them. The kind of men who don't ask questions, just follow orders. There's more, Mayor Henderson added. Garrison's been spreading word that you're a dangerous fugitive, that the town needs protection from you. He's got some folks scared enough to believe him. Jonas felt the familiar cold rage building in his chest. How many people believe his lies? Enough, Morton admitted reluctantly. Jonas, I've got to ask, are you planning to run? The question hung in the air between them. Patience watched Jonas's face, seeing the internal struggle between the man he'd become and the man he'd once been. No, Jonas said finally. I'm done running. Then you'll need help. Doc Bailey surprised them all by speaking up. I served in the war, and I remember what it means to stand for something worth defending. This isn't your fight, Doc. It became my fight when armed thugs rode into my town threatening decent people. Mayor Henderson nodded agreement. There are others who feel the same way. Garrison may have money and hired guns, but this is our home. Over the next 2 days, an unlikely alliance formed around Jonas and Patience. Mrs. Fletcher opened her boarding house as an unofficial headquarters, while Doc Bailey tended to weapons and supplies. Even some of Patience's students' fathers, men who had once viewed Jonas with suspicion, came forward offering their support. But it was Sheriff Morton who brought the most crucial intelligence. The territorial judge arrives tomorrow, he announced. During a meeting in Mrs. Fletcher's parlor, Judge Nathaniel Brooks, riding the circuit from Denver. If we can present our evidence to him. Garrison won't let it get that far, Jonas interrupted. He can't afford to let a federal judge see those letters, which means he'll have to move tonight, Patience realized. Before the judge arrives. Jonas nodded grimly. He'll come for us both, probably burn down half the town in the process and blame it on the dangerous fugitive. The group spent the evening making preparations. Jonas distributed weapons to those who could handle them, while Patience and Mrs. Fletcher prepared medical supplies and emergency provisions. The atmosphere was tense but determined. These people had found something worth fighting for, and they weren't going to surrender it without a struggle. As the sun set behind the mountains, Jonas found himself alone with Patience in the small room where she'd been staying. She was packing her father's Bible and the precious letters, her movements careful and deliberate. I want you to leave town, he said suddenly. Tonight, before this starts. She looked up at him with steel in her eyes. Absolutely not. Patience. This is going to get ugly. Men are going to die and I can't— You can't what? Protect me and fight Garrison at the same time? She moved closer, placing her hands on his chest. Jonas, I'm not the 7-year-old girl who made you a promise. I'm a woman who chooses to stand beside the man she loves. But if something happens to you, then it happens to us both. I'm not leaving you to face this alone. Jonas pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. He could feel the steady beat of her heart, the strength in her slender frame, the absolute certainty of her commitment. I love you, he whispered against her hair. Whatever happens tonight, I want you to know that these past weeks with you have been the happiest of my life. Then we'd better make sure we have many more weeks ahead of us. As midnight approached, the defenders of Pine Ridge took their positions. Jonas positioned himself in the church bell tower, where he could see all approaches to the town. Patience insisted on staying at Mrs. Fletcher's with the other women, ready to tend wounded or fight if necessary. The waiting was the hardest part. Jonas checked and rechecked his weapons, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. He'd fought many battles in his younger days, but none had felt as important as this one. This wasn't about survival or revenge. This was about protecting something precious, something worth redemption. When the attack finally came, it began with fire. The first building to go up in flames was the new lumber for the schoolhouse, stored behind Miller's general store, then the livery stable, then Mrs. Patterson's house on the edge of town. Garrison's men were systematic, methodical, driving the townspeople toward the center of Pine Ridge, where they could be controlled or eliminated. Jonas could see the riders now, dark shapes moving through the smoke and flames, professional in their movements, deadly in their intent. 6 men, as Morton had predicted, plus Wade Garrison himself directing their actions from horseback. The real battle was about to begin, and Jonas knew that everything, his past, his redemption, his future, with patience, would be decided in the next few hours. He settled the rifle against his shoulder, said a quiet prayer to the God he'd learned to trust through Preacher Samuel's Bible, and prepared to become the mountain man one last time. Below in the town, Patience clutched her father's letters and watched the flames grow brighter against the darkness. Whatever happened tonight, she was ready to face it with the man she'd promised to marry 16 years ago, when she was too young to understand what promises really meant, but old enough to recognize love when she saw it. The simple gold wedding ring had been hidden in Jonas's dresser for 3 years, purchased during one of his rare trips to Denver when hope had seemed possible, but distant. He'd never imagined actually using it, but as gunfire erupted in the streets below, he found himself clutching it like a talisman against the darkness closing in around them. Garrison's men struck with military precision, their attack timed to maximize chaos and confusion. From his position in the church bell tower, Jonas could see them moving through the smoke-filled streets. Professional killers who'd done this kind of work before, systematic in their destruction. The first shot shattered the bell tower window, sending glass cascading around Jonas's feet. He returned fire immediately, his bullet taking one of the riders from his saddle. The mountain man's skills hadn't dulled with age. His hands were steady, his aim true, his instincts sharp as ever, but there were too many of them, and they knew it. Doc Bailey and Mayor Henderson held the main street, firing from behind overturned wagons and storefronts. Sheriff Morton coordinated the defense from his office, his voice cutting through the gunfire as he directed the townspeople to safer positions. "Jonas!" Morton's voice carried across the square. "They're trying to flank us from the east." Jonas shifted position, scanning the smoke-shrouded buildings. There, 2 figures moving between the shadows, working their way toward Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house, where Patience and the other women had taken shelter. His blood went cold. This wasn't random destruction, it was targeted elimination. Garrison was going after Patience specifically. Jonas abandoned his elevated position, sliding down the bell rope and hitting the ground running. He moved through the chaos with the fluid grace of a man born to violence, his rifle barking death at anyone who stood between him and the woman he loved. The first gunman never saw him coming. Jonas's shot took him in the chest, spinning him around into the street where he lay still. The second man was more alert, diving behind a water trough as Jonas's bullets sparked off stone. "Mountain man," the killer's voice was mocking, confident. "Heard you'd gone soft, old-timer, living quiet, playing house with the school teacher." Jonas didn't respond. Words were wasted in moments like this. Action was the only language that mattered. He circled wide, using the burning buildings as cover, his movements patient and predatory. This was what he'd been before redemption found him. A hunter of men, efficient and deadly, motivated by survival rather than conscience. The gunman made his mistake when he assumed Jonas would come straight at him. Instead, Jonas approached from behind, rifle raised, voice deadly calm. "Drop your weapon!" The man spun, pistol rising, but Jonas was faster. His shot took the gunman in the shoulder, sending him crashing backward. Before the man could recover, Jonas was on him, rifle pressed to his throat. "Where's Garrison?" "Go!" "To hell!" Jonas's expression never changed, but his voice carried the promise of violence. "Last chance." The man's eyes widened as he recognized something implacable in Jonas's face, the same merciless certainty that had made the mountain man legend. "The boarding house," he gasped. "He's going for the woman." Jonas struck him with the rifle butt, leaving him unconscious but alive. He'd killed enough men in his life. He wouldn't add to that count unless absolutely necessary. Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house was already burning when he arrived. Smoke poured from the first-floor windows, and he could hear screams from inside. Without hesitation, Jonas kicked in the front door and plunged into the inferno. The heat hit him like a physical force, searing his lungs and stealing his breath. Through the smoke he could see shapes moving, women trying to escape, someone helping them toward the back exit. "Patience," he called, his voice hoarse with smoke inhalation. "Jonas!" Her voice came from upstairs, weak but alive. "I'm trapped." He took the stairs 3 at a time, following her voice through the smoke-filled hallway. He found her in the last room, pressed against the window as flames licked at the doorframe behind her. "The stairs are blocked," she gasped as he reached her. "I couldn't get past the fire." Without hesitation, Jonas gathered her in his arms and carried her to the window. 3 stories down, Doc Bailey and several other men had spread blankets, ready to catch her. "I need you to jump," he said, helping her onto the windowsill. "What about you?" "I'll find another way down." "Jump, Patience. Trust me." She looked into his eyes one last time, seeing all the love and determination there, then closed her eyes and fell. The men below caught her safely, rolling her away from the building as burning debris rained down. Jonas turned back toward the hallway, looking for another escape route, but the flames had spread too quickly. The building groaned ominously around him, its wooden frame succumbing to the fire's hungry embrace. Through the smoke and heat, he heard footsteps on what remained of the stairs. Someone was coming up, moving against the flames with deliberate purpose. Wade Garrison emerged from the smoke like a demon, his face twisted with rage and madness, a pistol in each hand. "Mountain Man," he snarled, "time to pay for what you did to my family." The childhood drawing had survived the fire, clutched in Patience's hands as she stood in the street watching the boarding house burn. She'd completed it during her days in Pine Ridge, adding a second stick figure, a woman standing beside the Mountain Man, both of them smiling under a simple sun. Now she held it like a prayer as flames consumed the building where the man she loved was trapped with his enemy. "Jonas!" she screamed, trying to run back toward the inferno, but Doc Bailey held her back. "The whole building's coming down," he said grimly. "No one can survive in there." But inside the burning building, 2 men faced each other across a room filled with smoke and hatred. Wade Garrison's pistols gleamed in the firelight, his face a mask of 23 years of obsession and rage. "You destroyed everything," Garrison snarled, his voice raw with smoke and emotion. "My father built an empire, and you tore it down. With your self-righteous crusade." Jonas kept his rifle steady, his voice calm despite the heat pressing in around them. "Your father was a murderer and a thief. I tried to stop him from killing that judge. He was protecting what was ours, the land, the cattle, the railroad contracts. All of it would have been mine if you hadn't interfered. So you've spent 23 years planning revenge." Garrison's laugh was bitter as smoke. "I've spent 23 years building what he started. This whole valley will be mine, every acre from the mountains to the plains. You're just the last obstacle." The floor groaned beneath their feet as the fire weakened the building's support beams. Time was running out for both of them, but neither man seemed willing to back down from this final confrontation. "Even if you kill me," Jonas said, "the evidence will survive. Patience has her father's letters, his testimony. The truth will come out." "Will it?" "Hard to testify when you're dead in a fire, along with all those convenient letters." Garrison raised both pistols, but Jonas was already moving. His rifle shot took one gun from Garrison's hand, the bullet shattering bone and steel together. Garrison's scream of pain and rage echoed through the burning room. But the rancher wasn't finished. With his remaining good hand, he raised the second pistol, his eyes wild with desperate fury. "You took everything from me," he gasped. "Now I'll take everything from you." The shot rang out just as a section of the ceiling collapsed between them. Jonas felt the bullet tear through his shoulder, spinning him around, but his own shot found its mark. Wade Garrison staggered backward, his chest blooming red, his eyes wide with surprise. "This is for Judge Cross," Jonas said quietly, "and for all the others your family destroyed." Garrison fell among the burning debris, his obsession finally consuming him as literally as the flames consuming the building around them. Jonas stumbled toward the window, his wounded shoulder making every movement agony. The building was coming apart around him, beams crashing down, walls collapsing inward. He could see Patience in the street below, her face turned up toward him, her hands pressed to her mouth in desperate prayer. The window frame was too damaged to climb through safely, and the drop was too far to survive. But as he looked down at the woman who'd kept her childhood promise, who'd chosen to love a man the world called irredeemable, Jonas felt a peace settle over him. She'd saved him in every way that mattered. If this was how his story ended, at least it ended with love instead of loneliness, with redemption instead of regret. But as he prepared to make the desperate leap, he heard voices shouting from below. Sheriff Morton and several townsmen had arrived with a ladder, extending it up toward the burning building. "Jonas, the ladder!" Morton's voice cut through the roar of flames. Jonas gripped the ladder with his good arm, his feet finding the rungs, just as the floor collapsed behind him. Step by agonizing step, he descended through heat and smoke while the building disintegrated above him. Strong hands pulled him to safety, just as the entire structure collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning timber. He found himself on the ground, Patience's arms around him, her tears mixing with soot on his face. "I thought I'd lost you," she whispered against his ear. "I'm here," he managed, his voice rough with smoke. "I'm here, and I'm never leaving you again." Doc Bailey knelt beside them, examining Jonas's wounded shoulder with professional efficiency. "Bullet went clean through. You'll live to see your wedding day, assuming you stop collecting scars long enough to actually get married." Through the smoke and chaos, they could hear the sound of approaching hoofbeats. But these weren't more of Garrison's men. Judge Nathaniel Brooks rode into town with a federal marshal at his side, their timing perfect for the aftermath, if not the battle itself. As the flames died down and the immediate danger passed, Jonas looked at the drawing still clutched in Patience's hands, two stick figures standing together against whatever storms might come. The little girl who'd made him a promise had become a woman who'd kept it, and the mountain man had finally found his way home. 6 months after the fire that had nearly consumed them both, Jonas Shepherd stood at the altar of Pine Ridge's rebuilt church, his left arm still bearing the scar from Wade Garrison's final shot. The new wedding band set he'd commissioned from the town blacksmith caught the morning light as he adjusted his collar. 2 simple gold rings that represented something far more precious than the metal they were made from. The church was packed with townspeople who had once viewed him with suspicion, but now called him friend. Mrs. Fletcher sat in the front pew, beaming with pride as if she were giving away her own daughter. Doc Bailey served as best man, his military bearing softened by the genuine affection he'd developed for the former mountain man. Even Sheriff Morton had polished his badge for the occasion, his weathered face creased with an uncharacteristic smile. When the doors opened and Patience appeared, Jonas felt his breath catch in his throat. She wore her mother's wedding dress, altered by Mrs. Fletcher's careful hands, and carried a bouquet of the same wildflowers she'd picked as a child. Her auburn hair was crowned with simple white blossoms, and her eyes held all the joy and certainty that had marked her childhood promise 16 years ago. As she walked down the aisle, Jonas remembered that long-ago evening when a 7-year-old girl had looked up at him with complete faith and declared her intention to marry him someday. He'd laughed then, unable to imagine that such innocence could transform into this moment, this woman choosing him not out of childish fancy, but out of mature love and understanding. The traveling preacher who'd come to perform the ceremony was cut from the same cloth as Patience's father, a man who believed in redemption and second chances, who saw the good that could grow from the worst circumstances. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice carrying easily through the packed church, We are gathered here today to witness the union of two souls who have found in each other the completion they've been seeking. Jonas listened to the familiar words, but his attention was focused on Patience's face, on the tears of joy that sparkled in her eyes, on the way her hands trembled slightly as she held his. When it came time for vows, Jonas spoke from his heart, rather than from any written words. Patience, 16 years ago you saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. You saw a man worth loving, worth saving, worth waiting for. You've kept every promise you made to a lonely mountain man, and I promise to spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of your faith. Patience's voice was clear and strong, despite her tears. Jonas, you taught me that love isn't just about finding the right person. It's about becoming the right person. You've shown me what it means to change, to grow, to choose goodness every day. I promise to stand beside you through whatever storms may come, just like the little girl in my drawing always knew I would. When they exchanged rings, Jonas slipped the gold band onto Patience's finger with hands that shook slightly, not from nerves, but from the overwhelming realization that this moment was actually happening. The woman who'd made him a promise as a child was now making him promises that would last a lifetime. The kiss they shared was gentle and sweet, witnessed by a community that had seen them fight for their right to love each other. When they turned to face their friends and neighbors as husband and wife, the applause was thunderous, filled with genuine affection and respect. After the ceremony, the celebration moved to Jonas's ranch, which had been transformed by willing hands into a proper wedding venue. Tables groaned under the weight of food, contributed by every family in Pine Ridge, and children ran between the adults with the exuberant joy that only such occasions could inspire. Jonas found himself in conversation with Judge Brooks, who had officially cleared his name and expunged all federal warrants based on Preacher Samuel's evidence. The documents from Georgetown had indeed been recovered, providing conclusive proof of Buck Garrison's crimes and Jonas's innocence. "You're a free man, Mr. Shepherd," the judge had said during the legal proceedings. "In the eyes of the law, you always were." Now, at his wedding reception, Jonas reflected on how much that freedom meant, not just legal freedom, but the freedom to love openly, to build a future without the shadow of the past hanging over him. Patience appeared at his side, slipping her hand into his with the natural ease of a woman who belonged there. She changed from her wedding dress into a simple blue gown that brought out the color of her eyes. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, noting his thoughtful expression. "How different this is from what I imagined my life would be. Better, or worse than your expectations? Better than my wildest dreams." He squeezed her hand gently. "What about you? Any regrets about marrying a reformed outlaw?" Patience laughed, the sound bright and musical in the mountain air. "The only thing I regret is that it took us 16 years to get here." As the sun set behind the mountains they both loved, the last guests began to make their way home. Mrs. Fletcher pressed a wrapped package into Patience's hands. "Something for your new home, dear," while Doc Bailey clapped Jonas on the shoulder with gruff affection. When they were finally alone, Jonas and Patience sat on their porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The same peaks that had sheltered Jonas during his years of exile now stood as witnesses to his redemption. Patience had framed her childhood drawing, and it now held a place of honor in their home. Two stick figures standing together, representing a promise kept and a love that had grown from innocence into something deep and lasting. "Do you think we'll have children?" Patience asked, her head resting on Jonas's shoulder. "I hope so. This valley needs more laughter, more young voices. And what will you tell them about their father's past?" Jonas was quiet for a moment, considering. "I'll tell them that everyone deserves a second chance, and that love has the power to transform even the hardest heart. I'll tell them that sometimes the best people are those who've had to fight hardest to become good. And I'll tell them," Patience added softly that some promises are worth keeping, even when they take 16 years to fulfill. The mountains stood silent around them, keeping their secrets as they always had. But now those secrets included the story of a little girl who'd seen the future in a mountain man's eyes, and of two people who'd found their way home to each other, despite all the obstacles the world had placed in their path. In the distance, a night bird called its lonely song, but Jonas Shepherd was no longer lonely. He'd found his place, his purpose, and his peace in the love of a woman who'd never stopped believing that redemption was possible for anyone brave enough to seek it.